today's our last full day together. And I hope to start bringing some of these threads into greater clarity and how they tie up with one another. This morning, I'm going to be looking at the third of these tasks, which corresponds to the path of seeing, or the path of vision. And it has to do with the experience of nirvana. Now, nirvana is a word that has entered our vocabulary in English, I guess in German too. And we find it used in all kinds of contexts. Nirvana is, it's used in advertising to sell holidays to tropical islands and things like this. On the other hand, nirvana, when we get into the Buddhist context, becomes something very elevated, equivalent to enlightenment itself, to liberation, freedom. And it might be helpful, before we begin, just to ask yourselves, have you experienced nirvana? Have you experienced nirvana? Have I experienced nirvana? There was a podcast a couple of years ago by Robert Wright, in which he interviewed a very well-known American Buddhist monk. And he asked him that question. If anyone's realized nirvana, it must be this guy. Have you experienced nirvana? And the answer was that the monk broke down in laughter at the absurdity of the question. Now, I find that kind of odd. The problem by elevating a term like nirvana, the experience of nirvana, to almost impossible heights, and for the most Buddhists to be extremely reverent to this idea, and certainly highly cautious or reluctant in claiming to have that experience themselves. That's reserved for the great enlightened masters, usually masters of the past, and perhaps a few enlightened souls who grace us with their presence today. But the consequence of that is that the idea of nirvana becomes increasingly out of reach. It becomes disconnected to our sense of everyday experience, like the experience we're having now, sitting in this room or listening to this talk online. Nirvana is way out there somewhere. And as a further consequence, a political consequence, this split between nirvana as an almost impossible or very remote goal and my kind of distance from that exaggerates another split, the split between the laity, the ordinary men and women who are not ordained, and the priesthood, the enlightened monks and lamas and roshis and ajahns and so on. So we have a sense that not only is nirvana out of reach for me, if I'm going to get it ever, it's probably necessary to become a monk or a full-time professional meditator in order to access this deep ultimate truth. And therefore, there's this idea that I am somehow disempowered. I am without power, without insight, without enlightenment, without wisdom. And yet these people who are in charge, the priesthoods, they are the ones in which these experiences are real, in which they've have been realized, and thereby these are the ones who have authority and power in the institution called Buddhism. Now, this is a very rough rephrasing of the philosophy of Ludwig Feuerbach, who pointed this out with regard to Christianity in the 1840s in a book called Das Wesen des Christentums, which became the basis for the Marxist critique of religion. In fact, it was Feuerbach who used the word religion is the opium of the people, not Marx. So in a secular approach that we're exploring here, then I am going to try and secularize nirvana and democratize nirvana. This, I feel, is what is necessary to do, and thereby abolishing this chasm, this split between the enlightened masters and the deluded people, and recovering the possibility of nirvana for everyone now. Now, one could, of course, say this is all very radical and so on, and what one might expect, but actually, we find a lot of material in the canon that supports this view very, very well. It's Buddhism that's kind of distorted this and rendered nirvana wholly sacred and out of reach. So in the early suttas, we find a very, very simple definition of nirvana. It's lobhakayo, dosakayo, mohakayo in Pali, which means ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion. Ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion. And this same definition is found with two other key terms, or three other key terms as well in the early texts. The unconditioned is also ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion. And another term, the deathless, when the Buddha defines that, he says likewise, ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion. So nirvana, or the unconditioned, or the deathless, are ways of talking about the absence of reactivity, basically. And the tradition has often taken this to mean the permanent absence of reactivity, where literally it's finished, over, for good. And that is why we have this problem with the word nirvana, because nirvana is generally thought of as the permanent ending of greed and hatred and delusion, and one enters into a kind of non-reactive eternity in reaching that state. But that may suit the interests of certain Buddhist institutions, but it actually conflicts with how the Buddha is using this idea in his teachings. This ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion is not something that only occurs after years and years and years of practice. It occurs all the time, simply because greed and hatred or confusion are impermanent. They come and they go. They rise and they pass away. Each time they pass away, they pass into nirvana. Nirvana is the place where they settle and come to rest and disappear. And that goes on all the time. Let me give you another example. I think this makes it even more clear. One of the phrases we find very, very frequently in the early texts is a way the Buddha speaks about the Dharma. I may have already given you that definition, but he also uses that same expression to describe nirvana. So nirvana, he says, is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, effective, and sensed by the wise or felt by the wise. So if nirvana is the permanent cessation of all reactivity, then that's not something that is clearly visible, immediate, etc. But the coming to a stop of a reactive pattern, even for a few seconds, even during a 20-minute meditation, is an experience of the stopping of reactivity. And as I've said before, the very fact of choosing to be mindful of these reactive patterns, that mindfulness itself is not reactive. There's already something nirvanic about mindfulness itself. And this comes through in the third term that the Buddha defines as ending of greed, ending of hatred, ending of confusion. Can anyone guess what that third term is? Probably not. It is the word embracing. First task, embracing life. Parinya in Pali, comprehending. The Buddha describes comprehension as nirvanic. In other words, to embrace life means to embrace life non-reactively, without attachment, without fear, without dislike, without egoism. And this is something that is where we begin this path. So this nibbana is clearly visible. It's immediate. It's something that we don't have to go through a series of steps in time to arrive at. It's akaliko. It is atemporal, non-temporal. In other words, it's right here. Do you know this story about the two little fish swimming in the ocean and swimming along, and then a big fish comes the other way and passes by them and says, "Hi, boys, how's the water?" And then he goes his way and the little fish carry on. And then after a few minutes, one of the little fish turns to the other one and says, "What's water?" In other words, the water is so close, it's their total living environment that they don't notice it. And in the Zen tradition, they sometimes say that we spend our lives like fish who swim for years through the ocean in search of water. It's the same idea. Nirvana is like that. Nirvana is the ambiance. Nirvana is the amniotic fluid, to use another example, in which we live and breathe. It's immediate. It's right there. But, as the Buddha himself says, it's clearly visible, but it's hard to see. It's in plain sight, but we don't notice it. I mean, this is a kind of theme you get running through a lot of different traditions. You find it particularly in Zen. You get so many accounts of these awakenings. And when they finally understand it all, they say, oh, that's what it means. Oh, I've kind of known that all along, but haven't really realized it. And it's inviting. There's something seductive about this non-reactive quality that surrounds us. It draws us. At moments we feel somehow attracted, pulled towards these ideas. And I think we do so because they resonate deep within us with a kind of familiarity, in a sense. And nirvana is said to be ineffective. In other words, it's a space in which we can live a life that has positive consequences. It helps us live better. And finally, it is sensed by the wise. Nirvana is something, or the Dharma is something that is sensed by the wise. The word in Pali is connected to the word Vedana, feeling. It's felt, intuited by the wise. And by the wise, we don't mean the wise Buddhists. We mean the wise people in general. The people we consider wise are those who are somehow in touch with this non-reactive space. As I mentioned, I'm reading a book by Simone Weil at the moment that I bought in Paris. And she also is, she uses a lot this term, le vide, die Lehre, the emptiness. And this is for her, in a sense, what she's kind of trying to articulate in her writing, how this vide is the space in which, for her, God's grace can enter life. So we've already mentioned that the wise are not just the Buddhists, but we find in Greek philosophy the idea of ataraxia, this untroubled state that is the goal of Epicureanism, the goal of skepticism, classic skepticism. But it's very close to the idea of nirvana. And in Chinese, we have wu wei, non-action, which seems, again, very much in the same area. Some of you might have heard of the Thai Ajahn called Buddhadasa, Ajahn Buddhadasa. He died maybe 20 years ago, but he was quite a prominent teacher in the latter part of the 20th century. I never met him. Martine met him. Other friends met him. But he published an essay in 1988 called Nirvana for Everyone. Nirvana for Everyone. And he says much the same thing. He says nirvana simply means those moments in our lives when we're not being reactive. He says even animals, all beings, have sustained periods where they're completely at rest, just going about their business, doing their thing. Maybe the deer in the forest or whatever it is in a nibbanic state. And human beings, although we are very prone to attachment and greed and fear and hatred and all these things, we also spend considerable parts of our lives without being particularly greedy or hateful or fearful or confused or ignorant or egotistic. You sometimes get the impression that in Buddhism, the human being is a kind of reactivity machine, just constantly kind of firing away on all cylinders with greed, hatred, confusion, ignorance, desire, and so on. Whereas in reality, there are moments like that, maybe too many of them. Maybe we're preoccupied with that stuff too much. But we also know quite well experiences, moments in life when we're going for a walk or when we're with friends, relaxing, or simply at odd moments in the day, we just feel at peace. And we wonder, where did that come from? And this non-reactive experience is common to all of us, except we don't really notice it or appreciate it. It's clearly visible, but it's hard for us to see. It's hard to really recognize that. And there's a very convincing, for me, dialogue with a man called Sivaka, where the Buddha asks Sivaka, because Sivaka comes to the Buddha and he says, what do you mean that your teaching, your Dharma, is clearly visible? And the Buddha says, let me ask you a question here, Sivaka. When there is greed and hatred within you, do you know that? Are you aware of that? And Sivaka says, yes. And then the Buddha says, and when greed and hatred are not active within you, are you aware of that? And Sivaka says, yes. And then the Buddha says, and that is why the Dharma is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, clearly sensed by the wise. Sivaka at this point is not a follower of the Buddha. He's just an ordinary guy with a penchant for difficult questions. And what the Buddha does here in a kind of Socratic turning around, puts the question to the questioner, turns it back to him, and then inquires into Sivaka's experience. And Sivaka admits, yeah, I'm fully aware when I'm not feeling full of greed and hatred and so on. In that case, in those moments, you have experienced how the Dharma, how Nirvana is clearly visible. You know it for yourself. There's something very Zen about this. But these are texts that go back. These are buried away, and this one is in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's very difficult to find, but it's there. And yet it's kind of got forgotten, these texts, because they don't fit well with Buddhist orthodoxy. And that's the fact that they're in the canon suggests that they're probably original, for the simple reason that it wouldn't have been in anyone's interest to add this kind of text later, because later they didn't think like this. So this leads also to an idea we find in Mahayana Buddhism. You don't find this in Theravada or early texts, and that's the idea of the natural nirvana. Rangshingginyangaladeva in Tibetan, I don't know what it is in Sanskrit. Natural nirvana. And this is considered to be a condition of life itself. That nature, as we would say today, is naturally at ease. It simply, the seasons come and the seasons go, and plants blossom and flower and shed their seeds, and new trees get born and so forth and so on. This entirely natural world that doesn't have any kind of human desire or fear built into it at all. This is said to be naturally nirvanic. Again, there's a resonance here very much with Taoism again. The way is the valley, and the water, it settles where it does. It always finds the lowest place. This is the Tao, the way. But this sense of the natural world being already at peace and at rest, and disinterested and unaffected by human desires and human plans, is again a sense of nirvana. And that may also explain why there is a long tradition of doing retreats in nature. When the Buddha says the monk goes into the forest and sits at the root of the tree, it's not just because it's less noisy there and he's going to be less disturbed. It's also because there's a kind of a living example in the natural world of this kind of nirvanic rest or ease, we might call it. So this natural nirvana is basically what allows us all to experience this stopping of reactivity, this stillness, this calm. Because just by observing, let's say, an anxious thought in meditation, rather than reinforcing it and fueling it, we just see it for what it is, and we just let it play itself out. In a text by Shantideva, he says you should be like a piece of wood. Whenever greed arises, hatred arises, stay like a piece of wood, ein Stück Holz. In other words, don't react. Just be there with it in a completely natural way. And it's in this sense that meditation is also something, at one level, deeply natural. And we might find that, although it might be a struggle at times to get into meditating, you will find, I think, more and more moments whereby you just come to rest. It may not last long, but you begin to get a taste for this restfulness, this ease, this quiet. And the third task is to recognize that, is to behold the stopping of reactivity, to come to rest in nirvana. Or we could use another term, emptiness. In the early discourses, emptiness is often used as a synonym for nirvana. Nagarjuna is the same. The two terms are pretty much synonymous. And how emptiness is described in the Pali Suttas is not as the ultimate nature of reality, the absence of inherent existence. There's none of that, which is the more traditional way we hear today. But emptiness is simply resting in a mind free of reactivity. There's a statement where the Buddha says, "For the most part, I dwell in emptiness. For the most part, I dwell in emptiness." And then Ananda asks him, "Well, what do you mean by that?" What's interesting here, I find, is that emptiness is not presented as something that you have to know or to understand or get insight into. That comes along much later, to have some meditative insight into the nature of emptiness. But emptiness is simply those moments when you are not under the influence of reactivity. That is to be empty. It's more like a kind of emptying, really, a letting go. We find this also in Nagarjuna, who's a 2nd century Indian philosopher. And he says, the Buddhas say that emptiness is letting go of opinions. It's a kind of letting go, it's a release, it's an emptying. But believers in emptiness are incurable. If you turn emptiness into a kind of a doctrine, and you believe in it, and you think of it as the truth, then you've missed the point. And both the Buddha and Nagarjuna are aware of how tricky it is to somehow to understand this, to not think of emptiness or nirvana as kind of states that we attain, but they're actually possibilities that are open to us in each moment. So the Buddha dwells in emptiness, he doesn't know emptiness. And dwelling, viharati, again is a term that's used widely in the early texts, but it doesn't quite get translated into a comparable word in English. It means to dwell or to live or to reside. So emptiness is thought of as a space in which we come to dwell. And again, dwelling is as fundamental to our human existence as is pathing. If you and cheminer, to path, to follow a path, the Eightfold Path, the four paths, the middle path. That's about how we get from one place to another, how we move through our lives. But that the other fundamental dimension of our human experience is that we stay somewhere, we dwell somewhere, we live somewhere. But again, like path, we don't really think through quite what that implies. It's so familiar that we don't notice it. So it's curious that the Buddha uses this word viharati as he says you dwell in emptiness, you dwell in samadhi, you dwell in mindfulness. Again and again and again, you have this idea. In other words, you kind of rest, you're at home there in some way. So let's try and apply this now to the text we have before us. The third task, basically, therefore, is learning how to dwell in emptiness, learning how to recognize those moments in which reactivity has stopped. I think a good word is perhaps to taste or to savor this feeling of non-reactivity. And so to notice those moments when things have become still and quiet, and rather just kind of barely being aware of that or just saying, hey, that's nice. Consciously valuing those moments. These moments are opportunities that are inviting us to come and stay in that space, rather than just wandering off and following the next impulse that takes us somewhere else. So this third task of beholding the stopping of reactivity, I think in many ways is the axis of the path. It's the depth dimension, the vertical dimension of the path. If we think of the path as linear, it's going from one place to a next, nirvana, or the stopping of reactivity, is there at each step as the depth of the experience, not the width or the breadth, but its depth. It's the dimension of depth. And so nirvana, therefore, is the point on which the path turns, we might say. In Shuangzi, the Chinese Taoist master, he says that emptiness is the hinge of the path. You understand hinge? Hinge is what when you open the window, it's the bit on which it turns. And so for Shuangzi, emptiness, he might understand that a bit differently, but nonetheless, this non-reactive openness of mind is the point on which the path turns. In other words, moves from, in this case, reactivity to responsiveness or to creativity. So the hinge between reactivity and creativity is this nirvanic space, this emptiness, in which there's this freedom to move from reacting to responding, from reacting to creating. So nirvana is not the goal of the path, and in traditional Buddhism, quite consistently in all traditions, you will read the noble Eightfold Path that leads to the end of suffering. And the end of suffering is nirvana, where there is no more greed, hatred, confusion. That's gone forever. And that is your eternal resting place. That's eternity. And when you die, rather than get reborn, you dwell in nirvana. So this, I think, is quite an important difference between traditional, or one might say religious Buddhism, and secular Buddhism. In this secular vision, nirvana is no longer the goal, but nirvana is actually more the ground. Nirvana is the axis on which the path turns. And in that sense, it is an ethical space, because it's the space in which we turn from a life that is driven by habit and by opinion and by cultural and social pressures, to a life in which we become more autonomous, more responsible, and, as we'll see this afternoon, less caught up in our self-centeredness, no longer locked into certain sort of rules and regulations, and also a space in which we find a renewed confidence. I think also we can think of nirvana, this nirvanic space, as the source of intuition, as we saw the other day, spontaneity, generosity, autonomy, creativity. So nirvana doesn't have all those things kind of already in there somehow, but it opens up the possibilities for us to live according to those kinds of values, rather than being pressured and driven by these deep-seated habits. So the 7 facets of awakening that constitute this this dimension of the path are effectively describing this axial nirvana. They're describing, as it were, the kind of the topography of nirvana, what it looks like, what it feels like, how we can somehow strengthen our capacity to remain there rather than to be thrown off course and taken somewhere else. And that's why I like to translate them as facets, like on a jewel, like a cut diamond with, say, 8 or 10 facets. Instead of thinking these strictly in a linear sense, to think of them as 8 different aspects of this nirvanic sensibility, we might say. And what I'm going to offer through in the meditation that comes out before lunch, I'm going to take you through a guided meditation in which we can learn to think of these qualities as somehow embodied in our own body, inscrit dans nos corps, sort of etched into our bodily experience. So once again, we start with mindfulness. In other words, the first step, as it were, to dwell in this emptiness or dwell in this nirvanic space is to remember to do that. So mindfulness here, and I think it's significant that it's at the top of the list, is basically to remember to pay attention to the stopping of reactivity or the non-reactive space. So to constantly remind yourself each time you get distracted, if we take this as a description of meditation, each time you get distracted, to bring the mind back and to say to yourself, look and see the stopping, dwell in the stopping of reactivity, notice it, taste it, savor it, feel it, and live there. And this takes time. It's by definition difficult to be aware of an absence. And non-reactivity and nirvana are basically the absence of something. A friend of mine, a bhikkhu in England called Ajahn Amaro, he gave a very good example of this. He said, it's like you're sitting in a room having a conversation with friends, and there's a refrigerator in the kitchen next door that's making this constant noise, right? And you kind of, it's a slight nuisance, but you keep talking, it doesn't really matter. You forget about it. And then suddenly it switches off. And then for a few moments, there's this amazing space of, wow, it's so quiet. It's not even that it's so quiet, and suddenly I can hear everything else. And you feel almost a sense of relief that that noise is gone. I mean, this is a very common experience in our modern world. But again, pay attention to what it's like in those moments to be aware of an absence. An absence is not just a sort of a blank, but an absence is both, on the one hand, a kind of a coming to rest, a peacefulness, a freedom, but at the same time, the absence of that noise, for example, allows us to experience, to hear everything else that noise was blocking out. It's also interesting to note that we enjoy the absence of the refrigerator for maybe 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and then we forget about it. Then we're back to the new normal, which is no noisy refrigerator. And we'll probably get irritated by something else. But the point is, there was a period where we savored and felt and appreciated the absence. And I've had the same experience in my garden. This summer, we had 3 old garden sheds were finally dismantled and taken to the dump. They'd been there for 50 or 60 years. And my mother-in-law refused to get rid of them because they're the garden sheds. We need them. We didn't need them, but that's beside the point. We got to a point now where they were just collapsing, so we got rid of them. And now, when I sit in the garden, where the sheds used to be, on the one hand, I'm still aware of their absence. It's been about a month or 2 now, so it's fading a bit. But I am aware of their absence. I'm aware of the space that's been opened up, and I'm particularly aware that I can now see so much more. I've now got many new perspectives, places where I can sit and have a cup of tea, where the whole landscape has changed because I've no longer got these buildings blocking my view. So you may find such everyday experiences helpful in grasping what it's like to somehow be aware of an absence. The absence in meditation is the absence of neurotic, chatting, compulsive thoughts and voices going on in our minds. And there are moments when that all quietens down. There are moments, even when it doesn't stop, we're no longer entangled in it so much. But it's similar to the experience of the refrigerator going off or the sheds being removed, that suddenly there's both a sense of relief, of ease, and a heightened sensitivity to what else is going on. So reactivity is a kind of a white noise, as it were. It's a sort of a constant nagging kind of chatter that periodically it dies down. Often it flares up. But to be mindful of the stopping of reactivity means learning how or training oneself really, to notice this non-reactive space and to feel it in the body. And that opens up the capacity for us to be able to wonder. The second of these facets, wonder. Again, I'm not totally settled on the translation. The word is Dhamma Vichaya, which is usually translated as analysis of the Dharma or Dhamma analysis, which again is very cerebral. I find it more helpful to think of wonder, or in English we say, we wonder about things. In other words, we're curious about things, we think about things, we ask about things. And that's connected to the word wonder, which is that deeper experience of being surprised, being amazed, being astounded, being overwhelmed perhaps by maybe some particular thing, or just the fact of being alive at all, being curious, being puzzled, being interested in what this experience is actually all about. And this was the training that I received in Korea, in the Zen monastery, was basically to cultivate this capacity of wonder. And the meditation we did, the only meditation I ever did in 4 years, was to ask myself the question, what is this? To the point where the words fade away and you're left with what is called a sensation of perplexity, a sensation of doubt, sometimes called the great doubt. And that's what feeds into my understanding here of wonder. So these facets of awakening, or let's say this nibbanic space, is one in which we're able to wonder. We're able to be curious. We're able to be surprised and astonished and amazed by what's happening. So there's something very vital and alive in this stopping. It opens up the capacity for wonder. Then we have energy, which, as we've seen, is kind of a repeat, a kind of necessary quality to apply. But remember, this is in the context of beholding the stopping of nirvana. Nirvana is peace, energy is energy, it's active. So we're, in a way, engaging with something that is at rest, but we're doing so with a very keen awareness, a very sharp attention, and also with a sense of, of enthusiasm, of this is really actually something that we find very engaging to explore this space. I'm actually now going to jump to the end of this list, because I'm really not convinced that the sequence is really that important. But what we might notice if we look at these 7 factors, we have 2 groups of 3, and 1 quality in the middle. We have mindfulness, wonder, and energy, which are basically active, engaged. And then we have tranquility, focus, and equanimity, which are basically learning about intensifying that sense of stillness. Tranquility is peacefulness, serenity, inner quiet, inner silence. And that's too one of the facets of awakening, a silent mind, a tranquil mind, a still mind. And this is a quality that's very linked with samadhi or focus or collectedness or concentration, as we train our minds to remain on a single object over time, that will bring the mind to rest into a more tranquil and serene space. And all of that, I think, is held within a certain kind of balance, which is where we have equanimity. Equanimity is a state of mind in which we're neither pulled towards what we are attracted to, nor are we pushing against what we find uncomfortable. And we're able to just remain in balance. We're aware of the pushing and the pulling, the attraction, the aversion, but we find an ability just to note that, but not be taken away by it. And equanimity allows, as it were, a kind of a ground, which is both firm and harmonious and balanced, which is in a way, a necessary condition for then focusing the mind. And by focusing the mind, we make our experience more and more still and calm. And then in the middle of this list, we have joy. So Nibbana is not an experience that is kind of just sort of neutral and flat, but it is also a space of joy. In fact, the word is sometimes translated even more strongly than that. It's translated as rapture or bliss. The word is piti. Piti. But I feel it's probably more helpful to think of this not as rapture, or ecstasy, but as joy. And joy, I mean, the word piti, or in Hindi, priti, is a very common woman's name. In fact, the British Home Secretary is Priti Patel. And so, yeah, she's Ecstasy Patel. Or in English, she'd be called Joy. You see? And so joy, again, is obviously something that is very, very desirable. We all want to experience joy. And I think what we find in this model is actually a framework for establishing conditions that will make us feel more joyful. And I'd rather not try to specify what level of joy is meant here. Is it really rapture, as you find in most of the Buddhist texts? Or is it just a sense of well-being? I find it more helpful, in fact, when analyzing and looking at many of these terms, not to try to isolate them and say, well, this is what they are, but rather to think of them as moments within a kind of a spectrum. So joy here, I think, is basically a way of talking about a sense of well-being, a sense of feeling content and comfortable at one end, and in certain moments experiencing great rapture and bliss. But it kind of covers that whole range. We don't need to, fix it at any point. It's a spectrum. So this gives us a kind of a picture of what this axial nirvana, this axis of the path, this turning point in the path feels like. We're mindful of what we're doing. We're mindful that we're going to dwell in a non-reactive space. We hold that in mind. That allows the capacity to be interested, curious, wonder, inquire. It allows also, when we're not caught up in reactivity, to have energy for other things. It is grounded in an equanimity, a focus, tranquility, and stillness. And that whole experience is infused with well-being and with joy. For me, this is the core of the in the four tasks. This third task is really is saying the most about the meditative state. This is, I feel, what meditation in many ways is about. It's about cultivating these different aspects of awakening and learning somehow to dwell in that space, not though as an end in itself. Now we're experiencing nirvana and this is all we really have to do, but recognizing that this is establishing for us another basis on which to live in the world, to respond. And that's why it is the precursor of the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path emerges out of this space. So we'll stop here and we'll now have a 30-minute break, and we'll come back at 1:30. That's 11:30 for us in Germany. And we'll then have a period of discussion. And as I said, at 12:15, I'm going to do a guided meditation on these 7 facets of awakening. I'll take you through them in a meditative session. Thank you.